Let's start with Jack Grippi, our presenter tonight. Jack, I won't get in, you can go more depth of your background, but essentially you are a geological engineer. Is that close enough? Or yeah, geology. So he's coming toward the program. He's not a native San Franciscan. He's retired and coming to San Francisco. He leads a walk about earthquakes in Chinatown and that kind of thing. So we were really excited to bring Jack in because he understands the terra firma. He understands why we had an earthquake. He will extend that into why we didn't have any water and why we didn't have, buildings that would both survive an earthquake or survive a fire. So there's lots of stuff. He's got lots to tell us, and feel and you will have your opportunity at the end. We'll do Q&A, so we won't interrupt him. And then the Q&A will also be fed to us by the people who are online. Anything else we need to say? Go for it, Jack.
Okay, well, thank you very much. My name's Jack, and I'll be speaking to you tonight for about 15 minutes. And I'd just like to thank San Francisco Historical Society and John for hosting this event, and also to the studio audience and also the online audience. So being a geologist, we'll talk about the earthquake and fire, and clearly we'll have to talk a little bit about geology, and kind of half of the talk will be with regards to lessons learned and what we didn't learn and such. So the first slide here, and I appreciate some of you are not as familiar with San Francisco and some of the streets and such, so you're gonna have to bear with me, so to speak, the people who are online, because you may not be as familiar. And also I just wanted to say that I'll be covering a lot of different topics. So I'm gonna be I may be talking below your intellect or your knowledge because it's a very learned group here, but please feel free to ask questions at the end during the Q&A period, okay? So this first slide here just shows almost like a Hollywood set in my mind. This is on the west end of the fire during day one, and okay, I'm just getting familiar. There we go, there, clicker marks. So I'll start with an outline, and before we can get to the lessons learned, the uneven path of them, I wanted to give us kind of a foundation. So I'll talk a little bit about the geologic setting of the San Andreas Fault, which is really responsible for all this activity and the beautiful landscape that we actually are fortunate to live here. And we'll also talk a little bit about the geology of the peninsula as it relates to how San Francisco fared. And then we'll also talk about the actual earthquake, okay? But I'll just point out, we'll have a conclusion at the end, but for some reason that bullet's not there. But the conclusions will be that, we like to learn from our mistakes and from things that happen to us, but sometimes we cannot take advantage of all the things that we would like to do or change because there's competing factors. And I think I'm going to try to impress upon you that those are some of the issues that San Francisco was faced with. Okay. There we go. So this is the first slide, and it's about the plate tectonics of San Francisco, the San Andreas, and they didn't put that statue in that position. But that's Louis Agassiz, who was a very famous naturalist from Harvard, a geologist and a paleontologist, but he was probably the father of glaciology. But here he is. The Stanford University campus didn't do too well. Okay, so maybe we'll just start initially with a little bit about plate tectonics. I think everyone is maybe familiar with it a little bit, but in essence, what we want to just show is that the Earth is composed of approximately 9 large plates and some smaller ones. And these plates are in relative motion, and you can see on this map here. So the continents, as we know them, such as North America, are in tan, and then all the other colorful things show the limits of a plate. And these plates are, think of it as the shell on a hard-boiled egg. And these plates are in relative motion. And then the arrows indicate the relative motion between the two plates. So we can have plates that are in extension, such as right here, the mid-Atlantic ridge. So you can see the different plate boundaries by the arrows. And some plate boundaries are under compression or convergence, and then some are just sliding past one another. And that's the San Andreas, actually. And the San Andreas is right here, okay? The boundary between the Pacific plate and the North American plate, okay? Pretty straightforward. And the plate movement is every day, all the time. It's constantly moving. So it's not moving that fast, but in the order of centimeters or fractions of an inch per year. Some plates are moving faster than others. Okay, so there we go. I think I got this figured out now. So here's just a schematic of different plate geometries. Without belaboring it too much, there's one of convergence, where plates are colliding, and that's where the Pacific Ring of Fire is that you may have heard about, right? And then the extension, or where new plates are being formed and new ocean basins being formed, is shown here in this one. And then I'll just go to the next one, which that's San Andreas, where the plates are actually just sliding past one another, right? So there's the San Andreas fault, okay? Very famous, well-studied fault or plate boundary. And it's called a strike-slip fault in the sense that the strike or the orientation of that fault, which is kind of a semi-vertical, the slip or the relative movement is in the same direction as the fault. So that's the strike of the fault. And the fault is about 800 miles long, maybe close to 900. And the cumulative offset, meaning whenever there's an earthquake on it, there's displacement. The rocks break and there's movement. You've seen offset fences and things like that, maybe on the Hayward Fault, which is ripping apart Cal Stadium and such. But the point is here, the cumulative offset on the San Andreas is about 300 kilometers, or about 200 miles over the last 10 million years. So it's, we have a lot of time, 10 million years is very short for geologic time. But I think the other thing I wanted to just point out, that little inset you see on here, you can see that the San Andreas is a system of faults. There's not just a single fault. So there's earthquake risk associated with maybe the Hayward, which is over there, and the San Andreas, which is here, and other faults. So what I wanted to, everyone knows about the tectonic setting for the San Andreas fault, relatively speaking, right? So I wanted to just move into the geology of the Bay Area and how it pertains and is relevant to the setting of the peninsula and how San Francisco responded, not the humanity sense, but how the earth and the buildings responded to the earthquake. So here we are, this is the Bay Area. You can see we have water out here. The Golden Gate is here, and we can see, my goodness, a challenge with my finger here. We can see the Sacramento River cutting through like this, and we see a series of faults, the black one being the San Andreas, okay? But what I wanted to show is that this really elegant estuary bay that we call home is really the topography, the physiography is all a result of movement on those faults. And the geology I'm going to talk about is not the bedrock geology, the hard rocks that are coring Nob Hill or Buena Vista Hill and on, but really the younger sediments associated with the bay, and they're only less than 1 million years in age. So if we go to this next slide, we see here that sea level is not constant, right? We know that now because of global warming and sea level does change. But even in geologic time, there are reasons why sea level changes. And I think you're pretty familiar with continental glaciation, where during periods of glaciation, sea level actually drops because all that water that's in the ocean gets stored on land in the form of glacial ice. So here, 14,000 years ago, we could have walked out to the Farallon Islands. Sea level was almost 400 feet lower than where it is now. So if you want to look at the next slide, hopefully, we could see an image here, two images, which are shown on the left, and one shows during glacial time, okay, which is when that's the Golden Gate Bridge or the Golden Gate. I also do a tour of the Golden Gate Bridge, so, but that's the head of the peninsula, which is there, okay? But the upper slide just shows where sea level is lower, right? And it's 400 feet lower, so to speak. And you can see that the San Francisco estuary is actually an inland valley, right? And in the interglacial period, which is really the present time, which started about 18,000 years ago, the glaciers started melting. We had rising sea level, and about 9,000 years ago, seawater came into the estuary that we call home today. So there's probably 6 to 7 of these cycles where we have a terrestrial for stream deposits and things like that, to here where we have estuarine deposits. So the land around us is actually composed of a lot of bay fill, natural bay fill, okay, through geological processes. And so I just wanted to go on to the coastline that we can see around the peninsula or around the world can be as dramatic as the one on top, which is actually Ireland, where that edge is a knife's edge between water and land, sea and land. And we can see this Martian beach here, and we have this kind of very transitional coastline, right? That would be parts of the estuary. These would be intertidal, lagoonal, tidal marshes, on and on. And parts of San Francisco look like that. What a great place to build there. So you know where we're going. See if I can, yeah. I'm going to get this eventually. So here, I'm sure most of you are familiar with some of these areas, some of you local people, maybe the studio, the online audience, not as much, but the point is that this is an old map of San Francisco. Market Street is indicated in red, just to put your perspective. But you can see pink areas. Well, pink areas are just like other pink areas, either in New York City or elsewhere, where communities, municipalities want to increase their footprint. And the first place that San Francisco increased its footprint was filling in Yibblewinder Cove with mostly sand, right? The blue is actually, let's just call it more natural causes. These are wetlands, these are estuaries and such that were built upon. So if you go back to this one, this bog here that you see, parts of the Mission Plank Road had to cross Hayes Valley Creek, and they drove 80-foot pylons into the bog, and some of them disappeared. There was no bottom. So, and there were talks about cattle grazing and jumping from one somewhat stable piece of turf onto another and then disappearing, So it was not a great place to be building a city in some of these localities. So let's go to this one and then the next slide. But, clearly people thought differently back then, and now we're starting to change a little bit. But here you can see this quote in 1856. But in essence, it's saying, nature having given us a safe and commodious harbor, it is for the hand of art to make the port commensurate with the requirements of a great commercial metropolis. So we do whatever we want to do with the physical environment without really thinking about the ramifications and such. So let's move on to, you got kind of the background there. Let's move on to the actual event. 512, maybe many of you were familiar with this. 7.8 magnitude. The image in the background is the Carrizo Plain. It's in Southern California, right along the trace of the San Andreas. So you can see the scar it has left after repeated movements. And here is Point Reyes and Tamales Bay, which is a lovely spot. But it's lovely because we have activity, you know. We have a dynamic Earth. And the duration of the event, being of 7.8 magnitude, is less, it's about a minute in duration, but it's a long minute. And the epicenter is just west of San Francisco. Rupture length, even though the San Andreas Fault is 800 miles long, on a given event, the whole 800 miles doesn't rupture, doesn't rip open. Well, I won't say rip open, but actually move because of the movement of the plates, but a portion of it moves. And the greater the portion, the greater the magnitude of the event. 300 miles is quite a bit. From San Juan Bautista up to Cape Mendocino. And the speed of that ripping, or like a zipper, think of it, is about 2 miles per second. It happens. And the displacement, so if you're standing on one side of the fault and I'm on the other side, we would be separated by about 15 feet. Okay, next slide, please. So here's the burn district. Okay, there's 3 days of burning. Yellow is day one. Market Street is on the bias. You see, I tilted the map to reflect, to be able to put it on a landscape image. And you can see day 2 is in red, and day 3 is in blue. And you can't see the coastline, but the coastline is shown from the 1850s. And we know that much of the financial and the warehouse district was actually in Yerba Buena Cove, right? I'll just state that the western limit of the actual burn district is Van Ness Boulevard, or Van Ness, I'm sure you're familiar with that, and also Dolores Street. I think the thing to just point out that was really very critical for San Francisco is the waterfront was saved. And that's through the efforts of the Navy and a specific Lieutenant Freeman, who really didn't get his due. He ends up being discharged from the Navy, dishonorable discharge, but his ashes were actually put back into the bay when he died in 1941. One of many pictures, it's actually one of the promotional images. It's day one. You know, there's no water, which I'll talk about a little bit later more, but the fire is chewing up the city, block after block after block. It's a very combustible city in the sense that there's a lot of wood structures, and you can see the firestorm or the conflagration from a distance here, which people could read at night by this flame. So next slide. And it became very apparent of the 400,000 people and the 200,000 people that were left homeless, their population is a little over 400,000, they could get out of the city by going down to the ferry building, the Embarcadero, or was East Street. And you can see the chaos, maybe, of just horse-drawn carriages that are just a rat's nest of people trying to leave to get to Oakland, you know. And they were also leaving by train. So this was all possible because the waterfront was actually saved and the ferry building was not terribly damaged. So here you can just see an image after 3 days of burning, you know, what the city looked like. This is really a downtown. You can see the St. Francis, the Fairmont. People who are familiar were looking up Powell Street. And it's really pretty shocking to what happened to this city. The largest disaster or fire for any city in the United States. Chicago came close, but in 1871, but we got them beat. So next slide, just another vista. And this, I mean, I don't want to belittle Hiroshima, but this is now the residential district, and it's all wood. And all you see is really foundations, and you see the network of streets. But you can see we're on Hyde in California. The Ham and Eggs fire, if you're familiar with it, is pointed out. City Hall, which didn't fare very well, is in the backdrop here. Next slide. Okay, so lessons learned. This is the other part. The ferry building, clearly everyone's familiar with that. You know, the 1890s structure that's actually out on the water, but actually was pretty secure in how it was built. So the first lessons learned I wanted to talk about was seismology, or earthquake science. It's pretty straightforward. It was the governor at the time commissioned Andrew Lawson, who was a professor at Cal, and he is the guy who named the San Andreas Fault in its locality at Lake San Andreas along Highway 280. And he appoints an earthquake investigation committee 3 days after the fire. Lawson et al. And many scientists come out with a report in 1908, volume 2 is 1910, and it's a seminal report. I mean, it, to this day, is how you study earthquake events, okay? So it's very thorough, and it really is the birth of modern earthquake science, or seismology, and integration of geology within the United States. And also, you know, they knew very little bit about the San Andreas then, but they were able to walk the San Andreas its entire length, and they were able to measure it as being 600 miles long, which this was a new thing. And it had horizontal displacement, which we've been talking about, and it had the capacity to have recurring earthquakes. You know, so we weren't gonna like take a break for the next century, which was touted and such. And the horizontal displacement is a big deal because most people in their time, in the turn of the century, thought of the earth movement and such being more vertical. So it really changed the outlook. And most importantly, the Reed elastic rebound theory, which I'll just show a graphic, is really the driving force to this day how earthquakes actually behave and how they form and such. So if you read the last bullet, earthquake occurrence attributed to a cycle of long-term elastic strain, you can think of elastic strain as stretching of a rubber band, okay? You can stretch a rubber band and you can release that force that you're putting on that rubber band, and the rubber band goes back to its original position. That's elastic, okay? The rubber band is behaving in an elastic way. Rocks also behave that way. It's just when you stress them or strain them, meaning you put enough force on them that they actually break. That's when the actual earthquake happens. So let's go to the next slide. I can do that, I think. There we go. There's Reed on the lower right. And this is just a little sketch. It shows the San Andreas Fault. There's the San Andreas, and we're looking at different times. This is in years, because fault events don't happen every day. The plates are moving every day, but you have to build up elastic strain in the rocks, and that is expressed. By this fence that's shown here, this grid. And you can see here that that grid is being distorted. But right where the San Andreas Fault, it's still locked up, so to speak. So that's the elastic aspect of the rebound theory. And once the amount of strain on that fault exceeds the ability of the rocks to stay together, it's just like pushing a refrigerator over a floor or something, okay? You can push, no movement, and then all of a sudden it breaks that coefficient of friction, and it dislodges and moves maybe 3 inches or something, if you're lucky, right? So what happens is, in this case, the actual event, in seconds and minutes, it actually breaks, and then it literally, my goodness, it catches up, so to speak. So you see here, this has kind of got this sigmoidal or S shape, and this actually catches up. So that's the rebound, where once the fault breaks it and dislocates it, the rock at the fault location breaks free and catches up to where the other rock has been stretched or bent. Okay? And that's attributed to Reed. Going on to structural engineering and fire issues, I wanted to just point out these two books, which the one on the left is actually by an architect at Cal, and the one on the right is by a geologist, science historian, okay? And the one on the left, Bracing for Disaster, really provides the thesis that, in fact, the architects and engineers that were rebuilding San Francisco, because the city rebuilds itself in 3 years, they actually incorporated some seismic resistant designs into their buildings. While the other author, he's really painting a picture that there was not much regard to incorporate new ideas and observations that they had, because they did extensive analysis or studies of how buildings failed as a result of the earthquake and fire. So there are two different points of view. I mean, they're both correct in a sense. And so what I'd like to do is just now advance to the next slide. Is that, and I mentioned or alluded to this before, that in fact, there was a lot of downplaying of the severity of the earthquake, right? There were actually officials and boosters, business people that, wanted to promote and downplay the notion that there was a big earthquake here. It was really a fire, because everyone knew how to deal with fires. There were fires in other cities and such. Earthquakes were kind of a new thing. And so there was this spin on the earthquake, and there was also a perception that people had that the city rebuilt itself without consideration of all this lessons learned about how do you build buildings in earthquake country. And there was a rapidity to build. By 3 years, 1909, the city's rebuilt, in essence. By 1908, there's in excess of 14,000 permits that are issued. And then here's a quote from the head of the building inspection department: "Our work is entirely inadequate to thoroughly inspect and enforce building laws." Okay? They couldn't follow them because they were inundated with the amount of construction that was going on. And if you're familiar with the Burnham Plan, which was a idealized vision of how the city could be rebuilt, that plan was actually had its foundation prior to the 1906 event, but it's actually delivered as a report the week of the event. So the Burnham Plan was going to revamp the city over a 50-year period, and in fact, it was pretty much ignored. And we can see in this slide here, this is the California Promotion Committee, and you can see the burn district, and you can see all the black structures. Those are all the buildings that have been permitted in the burn area. I mean, that's an incredible feat. So they didn't want to have what happened to New Orleans in 2005, I guess, Katrina. I think New Orleans has not recovered its population. They wanted to get back to building and back to making money, and they didn't want people to leave the city. So there was a great incentive to rebuild the city as quickly as possible. So I just wanted to mention here about issues related to fire and engineering, and they're kind of intertwined, and I'll probably go through them fairly quickly, but there was a committee of 40 established for the rehabilitation of San Francisco, monitoring and taking care of the homeless and rebuilding the city and taking in funds that were coming in donations. There was a committee headed by John Galloway that is, its directive is to actually issue new building codes by July of 1906, within a couple of months. And he's kind of, there are many people, detractors, that are saying, you know, this is a golden opportunity. You can actually rebuild the city properly, widen boulevards, and on and on and on. And all you're doing is the same old thing. And this is his quote, Galloway's quote: "In the face of such conditions, which is the loss of the commercial district, residential district, the infrastructure, on and on and on, the distribution system of water," he says, what San Francisco needs is the cheapest building possible in which business may be done to ensure the community enough to eat. The other subjects can wait. So there's another reason why people think that not much was done to learn from the actual event, because in fact, there was an earthquake in 1868, and they did learn how to improve their construction of buildings. Buildings in the Palace Hotel, which you may be familiar with, was earthquake and fireproof, and it was completed in 1875. So I'll just pass through some of this stuff, but the fire district was enlarged. So you can see here the old fire district, which really is supposed to be non-combustible buildings, Market Street running down, in fact, had many combustible buildings interspersed. So you can have a fireproof building, but if you're next to a couple of multi-storied wooden structures, you're going to have a hard time. So it's not going to work. But the compromise here was that within the new fire district, which was enlarged, they said you had to have a non-combustible roof. So they were compromising because the people in Soma, which are poor or working class Irish, couldn't put up with this. They couldn't build back, brick structures and such, to comply with it. So they had to navigate these issues. So there are some other issues that were implemented, but which one of them was the issuing of reinforced concrete, which I think was in transition, but it was known nationally to be very effective for having concrete reinforced flooring that would actually keep fires from passing through other floors and such. So I wanted to just talk about some of the structural engineering issues. There is no building code in California until 1926. In 1925, Santa Barbara is totally destroyed. And in 1926, Santa Barbara and Palo Alto are the only two municipalities in California that have building codes that explicitly state earthquake issues, okay? But, the codes that were modified in San Francisco, none of them say anything about earthquakes. But they know the issues related around earthquake, such as things falling. Cornices had a capacity to calve off, and parapets, and things like that. So they focused on those things, but never saying that they were earthquake related. So if we go to the next one, there's a beautiful cornice. That's the Sharon Building on New Montgomery, mega cornice. So that cornice had to be adhered in a significant way to the building in order to comply with the new code. And then we said parapets, and parapet, this Victorian building here has a parapet up here, but really we're talking about parapets like this. The skin of the building extends above the roof line, and things like that have a capacity to peel off and break off and kill whoever's below, which happened actually. So these are things that were common. And then the other thing I wanted to say, the reinforcing of concrete and lateral bracing was something that was discussed at great length, but not much done about it, except for that the structure of the building had to withstand wind forces of 30 psi. Never mentioning earthquakes, but here's lateral bracing on a newer building. But we'll see that buildings that were built were braced laterally. So we'll go to some of those here. The Humboldt Savings Bank, you may be familiar with. Toberner, the architect in that book, showcases a number of buildings that were actually rebuilt and incorporated methodologies and design efforts that were learned from how buildings behaved in the fire and the earthquake, primarily the earthquake. So this building here is actually under construction in 1906, and because it was under construction, it did not have to issue a new permit. They could have built it without any issue or changing, but in fact, there's the tower of the building, which you may be familiar with. It looks just like the old Call building, or the Spreckles. And here's the skeleton of the building, and here's a lot of verbiage, which I won't go through, which Toberner actually goes through and says that they actually were changing the design of the building, the foundation, the water system. They had lateral bracing, or these spandrels, which are in here, and knee braces. These are all elements that would have been something that you would put in a code. And if you look at the bottom quote here, the structure is a quote from Durleth, who is a very well-known engineer at Cal, who was also involved in the Golden Gate Bridge, an unbiased individual because he wasn't a part of any of the committees, but he did say that the structure represents a transition between the method of building in the old and the new San Francisco. So, things were happening, architects were changing their ways, but it really wasn't captured in code and other places. So I'll just point out here that the risk of a firestorm in San Francisco is very high. The National Board of Fire Underwriters in 1905 inspects the city, and their quote is telling, because it says, "San Francisco has violated all underwriting traditions and precedent by not burning up." So it was a place waiting to happen, And I'll just point out here that, the water distribution system, which was the Springs Valley Company, water company, didn't hold up very well. It was damaged. It was a leaky system after the event because of earthquake damage or fault damage. This is the San Andreas Fault. There are the reservoirs of Puarcitos, the Crystal Springs, the San Andreas, and then there are pipes that bring water into the city of San Francisco. And those pipes are greatly damaged. You can see in these couple of shots here. And these pipes were connected to homes, and so they lost all kinds of pressure, and there was no water to be had. I mean, maybe they had about 6% capacity of their water. And you can see in this particular slide here, San Francisco is on its side. You can see Yerba Buena Cove here. This is Hayes Valley Creek, and then this is Mission Creek, and that's Starving Sea. I'll just flip through these. So there's a detail. All that black stuff, the black line, and all the dots that you see, those dots are where pipes broke, and the black is where there's all liquefaction issues. So we can go to the next slide, and we can see Hayes Valley Creek, same thing. That's where they were driving those pylons into the plank road for Mission, along the Mission. And this is the Mission Creek corridor. Valencia Hotel is right here, which you may be familiar with. And we'll go to the next slide. That's Drunkard Row, right in Mission Creek, on currently South Van Ness, but at the time was different. The street name was Howard. So you can see what's happening is that the support for the buildings is gone. That's what liquefaction is all about. So, and it's the edge of the fire burn district. I'm going to move on. This is the auxiliary water supply system, which, was one of the big lessons learned. Aside from the seismology, which we went through, this was a $5 million bond issue to revamp the water supply system. And it's an auxiliary water supply system. These were being looked at in other cities, and in essence, these were parallel systems to the municipal water. So they were independent. And there's a lot of things you can do here, but it took, oh my goodness, it took 4 years to build, and wow. The goal was to reduce insurance premiums. 2 years prior to the actual event, insurance premiums go up by 140%. So you had to do this. You know, and the insurance companies were clamoring that they do this. They wanted it to have redundancy and be earthquake resistant. And water volume, delivery, and pressure were pretty important, and it had to be a dedicated system. The city of San Francisco wanted to use it to sprinkle the streets, and also flush the sewers, and they said, no way, this has to be dedicated only to firefighting. So in essence, here's the system. It consists of 3 reservoirs, the Twin Peaks, Ashbury tank, and the Jones tank. And then there's a pump station here and pump station there to draw water from the bay, okay? And there were a network of cisterns, which you might have seen around the city. There are over 170 of them. And this is the Ashbury tank. And these hydrants are extra fat. This is a gravity-fed high-pressure system, the largest in the world. Okay, and this is the Twin Peaks reservoir under construction, all concrete lined, reinforced with drainage underneath it. You know, they did a bang-up job, really, in doing this. And there's a celebration for that. And then here we see the brick-lined circles to denote where the cisterns are, right here. And there's the pumping station, and then there were 2 fireboats, which I may not have mentioned, but there are 2 fireboats stationed at Pier 22.5 at all times, and they were responsible to put out the fire in the Marina District during Loma Prieta, the Pier 45 fire recently in 2020. So I'll just go through a few slides here just to show you about liquefaction, okay? Liquefaction is when water-saturated sand or silt, like the sand that we dumped into the Marina District, you know, prior to PPIE, the Panama Pacific International Exposition, and also into Yerba Buena Cove. But here we see the Hayward Fault running right through Cal Stadium. This is LIDAR, it shows the topography. And this is in 1868. There is a fault, an earthquake on that fault. 6 people die in San Francisco. And even then, they realized that the real estate circular states real estate values of made ground will remain flat because made ground is susceptible to being more damaged, right? But people forget those things very quickly. So there are kind of just some photographs showing what happens with liquefaction, and you can see here that the post office and the pavement doesn't look very good because the underlying support is literally turning to liquid and it's pouring out. Another view, I don't know where this one is. These are sand boils, which are common and associated with it. Okay, there's just a schematic how a sand boil works. Just think of it like a volcano. Just think of it as a small-scale version of Hawaii. Okay? And that just shows Anchorage, Alaska. If you're old enough, you knew about the Good Friday earthquake there. A lot of liquefaction. And the slide on the upper top just shows that, in essence, what happens is the grains lose contact with one another and they behave like a liquid. Okay? And this may be of interest. This is south of Market. This is where the Hayes Valley Creek is. People may have heard about some of the issues that have gone on there, but here's a building on Clara Street. I think it may be in the 70s or so. And we can see the same building here from Google Images. Does it look different? That building is sinking. And they just reconfigured the front of it. They lost the first floor, right? It's sinking. And then you can see on these side streets that pull into, say, 7th Street, which is the main corridor, those streets have been maintained at grade, right? They've been asphalted, but the side streets, you can see that they are actually have to climb to get up to grade, okay? Because they're sinking with those arrows. And then this quickly just shows the Marina District. This is after the PPIE. They said, well, why don't we develop it? And you can see all these green and blue colors here in the center. That is all fill, okay, from the late 1800s to the 1912. And these are all the buildings in the Marina District laid on top that are red and yellow tagged, meaning that they're to be condemned. If red and yellow, they're not, you can go in, but for a very short time, you have to come out. 25% of the 6,500 buildings that were red and yellow tagged were in the Marina District. So it doesn't end there. You may have seen the news about the Mission Bay area, and they have sidewalk issues because Mission Bay is fill, and the buildings can be made to be pretty stable in that kind of a setting if you do it right. But the sidewalks and all the infrastructure around the buildings were not attached to the building. So they're sinking, and you have all these issues like this going on. Except for the medical center, UCSF Medical Center, they had enough sense and spent enough money to actually tie their sidewalks to the building, okay? But it takes money, right? So in conclusion, I just want to say that, you know, the goal is to build a resilient community that can withstand earthquake and fire and all these other things. But you have to remember where San Francisco was in 1906. It was devastated. They wanted to get back to business. You had multiple kinds of people at the table. The bricklayers were not keen on using steel reinforced concrete. You know, there were competing ideas. Well, we don't want to have to build brick or stone buildings. We want, you know, wooden houses again. And so there were all these competing factors. And so in essence, I think, you know, you have to deal with, you know, you have to have political will in order to achieve all these improvements and things that you know should be done. You also need wealth, and you also have to know how. You have to have the technology. Clearly, they didn't know what we know today, but they could have gotten closer to where we are today. And I'll just point out that enduring lessons learned is really the auxiliary water supply system, which was built in other U.S. cities in the late 1800s because of the whole issue about fire risk. And then also the seismology part. Geologists come through again, but the seismology part of it is really a enduring knowledge that we learned at that time. So I think, thank you, and any questions? Yes?
The start of the fire. The start of the fire. Do we actually know what started the Great Fire, or will we have theories?
No, but we know pretty accurately. There were in excess of 50 fires. Some people say 52. And there were other ones that were actually successfully put out that were in the Western Addition and other areas, even in the Mission. But the bottom line is that it exceeded the resources of the fire department, and there was no water. And clearly, there's flammable liquids that spilled, there's coals and wood-burning stoves, there's gas lines, there's electrical lines. There's many sources for fires, even the ham and eggs fire. You know, someone got up in the morning around 9 o'clock and they said, well, let's have some bacon and eggs. And their chimney and flue was damaged, and that started a whole fire front that was pretty consuming in terms of how much of the city it consumed. So there were many places, and they know, even though the fire alarm system was totally knocked out immediately, because it was actually in Portsmouth Square, and all the electrical batteries and everything that operated it just came off their shelves. So. Any other questions?
on the site.
How did the naval officer save the Embarcadero?
Well, the naval officer Freeman,
Frederick
Frederick Freeman, Lieutenant. Yeah, he actually was told to go down to Monterey by Funston after he arrived at the harbor of San Francisco, but he thought his efforts were better utilized there. He had firefighting boats with him, and they had, plenty of water, bay water, and so for 3 days, they were on the waterfront, keeping the fire at bay from the waterfront, which was very critical. It was primarily a harbor, a transporting type city, and he actually, I don't know if you watched Laugh-In and on the 60s, the phrase "sock it to me." Remember that? Well, he was using that phrase back in 1906 when he was telling his recruits or his personnel that he was there to attack the fire with the water and such. And "sock it to him" was the phrase that he used. Any other question? Yeah.
Oops. Along that same line, why was he then dishonorably discharged?
Just quickly, I think during World War I, he was still in the military, and I think he did something that was dishonorable. I can't recall, there was a book by Dennis Smith,
Right.
who was a former head of the fire department in New York City. It's not a very good book, actually, but it really documents something that's critical about this individual and his contribution. But exactly what he did, I don't know. And he was...
I do, Jack. Alcohol.
Yeah. And he was engaged actually by a subordinate, Pond, when he found him in Soledad near Monterey, and he was really kind of, on the outs. He was not, he was a broken man, but his ashes eventually got distributed in the bay. But he is a critical individual that really has no monument or recognition that's widely known. Thank you. Any other questions?
Over here. Chris?
This would be probably a totally unimaginable circumstance, but would there ever be a chance for two faults to go off at the same time, the San Andreas and the Hayward, if one triggered the other?
Yeah. So the question was, I think everyone maybe heard it, whether two faults within the same system or nearby that could simultaneously or near simultaneously erupt or be offset. Well, that's what happened in Southeast Turkey recently. It's the East Anatolian Fault, and it actually indirectly, directly, I don't think we know the exactly in detail, it triggered another event. The point is that these faults that make up the plate boundaries all around the Earth, okay, they are under strain, okay? And a rupture on one could adversely affect a nearby fault, reestablish the strain level, causing it to rupture. So it's possible. Whether it's possible in San Francisco, I don't know, the Bay Area and such, but when we talk about movement on these faults, we talk about probability. It's nothing like, in 2030, we're going to have 6.9 on such and such. It's all probability. It's just like, Las Vegas, in terms of what are the odds, of another one happening. And in essence, what they say is that there's a 72% chance that there'll be a 6.7 magnitude earthquake or greater in the Bay Area by 2043. That doesn't help us too much, but that's the kind of knowledge that they have. They cannot predict earthquakes. Okay? Yeah.
The Port of San Francisco says that the seawall needs to be rebuilt, and they're talking about needing to address sea level rise. But have we learned enough lessons to properly rebuild the seawall to address seismic issues?
Yeah, I really can't answer that. I know that there was a bond measure passed a few years ago to address the seawall. How far they are along it, what they're doing, I really can't address it or don't have enough knowledge to say. But clearly, that goes back to this resiliency and such. I'll just point out, you know, in the past, people never retreated. They just rebuilt. And San Francisco did that over and over. Now we're talking about retreating, actually abandoning places that we should not be living, such as the coastline in North Carolina on some of those barrier islands. During Sandy Hook in New York City, they were buying people out of their properties because they were in a flood area. So exactly what's going on in, with the Embarcadero seawall, I don't know very much, but you know, we as a society will have to at some point say, is it worth it to say, you know, such and such and such and such, or should we move people? I'm not saying that that's what we're going to do with the seawall, but you know, those are the kinds of issues that need to be addressed. Politics, yeah. Any more questions?
Another one back up here, Chris.
We're always being told to prepare for the next quote, big one. But in seismology, you do lots of smaller ones, negate the possibility or decrease the possibility of a larger one.
You know, yeah, so, yeah, the question may be phrased another way. So, you know, having an earthquake today, does that reduce the chance of an earthquake tomorrow on the same fault and such? Because some of that strain is being released. I don't know if there's a fast, cut and dry answer to that. You'd like to think that this period that we've had since 1906 has been very quiet. It's been a very quiescent period for the San Andreas, this segment of the San Andreas. But it's hard to say. I don't really feel I have the expertise to say one way or another. But intuitively, you'd think that it might be better to come to a place after the big one.
Well, I have a personal question, which was, where would you like to be in San Francisco? There is the one.
Well, not in the Marina District.
Right.
I want to be as close to bedrock. And bedrock comes to the surface in a lot of places. So if you can build your house on top of Telegraph Hill, that would be good. But you want to be as close to bedrock as possible. The bottom line is fill, okay, and water-saturated sand, like the beaches around the Marina District or whatever. What happens is that seismic waves, when they're transmitted through that kind of medium, they actually slow down. Remember how fast I was talking they were? They slow down and their amplitude increases. So you don't want to be on a lot of fill, you know. You can actually mitigate by building a stout house and such, but just get close to bedrock, okay? Any other questions?
We do have
We
a
have-
online.
that's one line question.
And over here.
Oh, yes. Up 2 years ago, I had my building seismically reinforced. And the civil engineer I was working with said that the biggest earthquake for transverse fault like San Andreas would be roughly the 1906. We want to get like 9.0. Whether that's true.
So yes, that is true. Without going into great detail, the San Andreas is probably the maximum recordable event. The thought is it's about 8.2 or so, okay? And the difference between a 7 and an 8, it's a logarithmic scale. So an 8 is 33 times more powerful than a 7. And then a 9 is about 1,000 times, because you have to multiply them. So yes, a translational or strike-slip fault can only store a certain amount of energy, which is what it is. And magnitude 8.2 is probably the biggest it could be. So, yeah. The big earthquakes are about 9.2, 9.3. The largest ever recorded was in Chile in the 60s, is 9.4. And they can't get much bigger than that because rocks are not capable of storing more and more and more energy because they'll break, you know. They have a limit, just like cement and everything else has a limit. Okay?
Well, I had a question, which was, you were showing the map that showed all the arrows that they were sort of divergent or whatever, and it looked like the San Andreas is the only one that used
So there are other, they're called transform faults or strike slip faults at plate boundaries, and there are not many, but there are other ones. The Alpine Fault in New Zealand, which you may have heard about, which keeps destroying, what's the town in
Christchurch.
South Christchurch, which is the nicest looking town in all of New Zealand. But so there's an Alpine Fault there. The North Anatolian Fault in Turkey is also a strike slip fault, but it's not right on the plate boundary. There's a Sumatran Fault. There's a number of them. But, the San Andreas is a very clean as the Alpine Fault is, but there's lots of big strike slip faults in Central Asia and such, in northern Vietnam where you were just recently. Any other questions?
And now from our streamers.
Okay.
Given that San Francisco remains largely built of wood and the water mains cross the mainland, what is it to prevent the city from burning again?
Well, so the city has the auxiliary water supply system, which is a big improvement from what they had before. I didn't go into a lot of detail, but there's a lot of redundancy in that system. It's a dedicated system with greater water fighting capacity and pressure and such. It can be replenished. There are shut-off valves. The pipe joints and such are not earthquake-proof, but they're earthquake-resistant. So, and the system in 2010, 2014, 2020, there were bond measures to improve upon the system. And then there were the cisterns. So there's a massive improvement in the capacity of the city to fight fires. That's not to say that there's a 0% chance that we're going to have another firestorm. I think it's less likely, and if it is, it will be much smaller and it will be contained. Okay?
Thank you. And next question. Are there other faults like the San Andreas in other parts of the world? If so, where? Do some geologists know where the next big earthquake will happen in San Francisco? Will the buildings be able to withstand the other earthquake, or as big as this one or bigger?
Well, I think I mentioned earlier about where there are other similar types of faults, New Zealand being one of the prominent ones, Turkey and such. And will the buildings resist it? Well, it depends on how the building's built. Clearly, the codes have improved, and the goal of the code is not to have an earthquake-proof building. It's have it as an earthquake-resistant building, meaning that the building will remain standing and people can get out without loss of life. So I think there is an improvement in the overall integrity of the buildings, aside from the Millennium Tower, which is a local thing that we have. When there's been soft story retrofitting, which people may have heard about, but again, wealth, if you have wealth, you can retrofit buildings. If you don't have wealth, you can't do it. So wealth is pretty important, and technology, know how to do it.
Right.
So,
Can I just add, buildings in San Francisco that have unique Japanese systems, one being the retrofit of the City Hall, the second one is the Young Museum. They're both, what are they called?
they're shock absorbers
Sure.
or base isolators.
Keep the building consistent and let it do a little waiting years.
And last question from one of our viewers online. My impression is that the working class did not go back to south of Market, but went to the Mission District. Did people
Right.
actually go back to the south of Market?
Right.
Yeah, I don't know the details of the demographic. Maybe you can comment. I mean, I'll defer to you if you want.
Right. I think the plan after the 1906 earthquake was to make that industrial and people moved out. Now, it was a mixed industrial because there were some people who could walk to work, but there was a lot of stuff down in that area that had been wooden buildings. Now we've got reinforced concrete buildings that are used industrially. So it's a mix in that area. So it's Mission District, true, but also all the way out to Excelsior. It was a lot of movement.
I understand you're going to build about 8,000 homes on TR.
Do the building codes require them to go down to bedrock, or can you even go down to bedrock? Okay. So I'm talking about Treasure Island and the homes that are being planned for there and whether they're going to be on bedrock. And I'll just comment about bedrock and Oceanwide Center, which is next to the Salesforce Tower. Okay, that I watched for 1 year as they drilled holes to bedrock. They're 2 meter across or 7.5 feet across to bedrock, and they're about 320 feet deep. So they're not going to build those kinds of footings for houses because no one's going to pay for it. They can drill to bedrock, clearly they can do it, but is it worth it, just for a house? Maybe they'll come up with a different kind of solution to ensure the stability of the homes, but I don't know exactly what's planned for there in terms of what specifically they're going to do to design it to make it earthquake resistant. What?
Sheer Wally.
Well, that's part of it.
piece to the
That's
puzzle.
part of it.
Yeah.
That's part of it.
Thank you, Jack.